Welcome to the Smart and Snark podcast, where real software engineers and real software managers discuss real software. On this podcast, I have my very bestest friend in the world, Mr. Matt Jaffee. Jaffee is a world-renowned computer scientist and astrophysicist. His role here is to try to educate us all on the value of technology and ultimately why we should succumb to its authority. As always, I am myopic middle manager Jason Ellison, whose role is to look good in front of upper management, claim to understand technology, and play this role. Okay, this is season 0, episode 8. It's a surprise. Before we get to the episode, Mr. Jaffee, we have a very important announcement. A big shout out to Sanket Jadhav, our 16th subscriber. I'm sure you noticed that on YouTube. They are super excited to subscribe before we blow up. I don't know if you have anything you'd like to say to them.
Welcome. Thank you. Tell your friends.
Really? You think people who subscribe to our channel have friends? Is that the bar right now?
You can dream.
Right. Okay, so thank you, Sanket. Now, episode 8 is a surprise. So, Jaffee, you have no idea what it is, but to get this rolling, do you have any guesses? Any guesses on what we're going to talk about today?
My only guess is that both I and our listeners will be extremely disappointed.
Come on. What if I told you it was best movies from the 80s? That's what we were going to talk about today. Were you born in the 80s? Were you even alive?
Yes, for a small portion of the 80s.
Do you have a favorite movie of the 80s?
No, mostly because I don't know what year most movies came out.
Goonies.
Did Die Hard come out in the 80s?
Yes. Best Christmas movie of all time.
Yeah, I like Die Hard.
All right.
I'll go with that one.
Okay, we'll go with that. But today, no, unfortunately, we will not be talking about the best movies of the 1980s. It will be something technical and something you know about. So clearly that list is super tiny and you should be able to guess. No guesses still. I should have known because in software development, you do lack imagination. So that's probably what's happening here. Let me just spoil the surprise for you. We are going to talk about BoltDB and Postgres, similar or not. So let's talk about BoltDB versus Postgres. I asked this question specifically to you, Mr. Matt Jaffee, as I know you recently performed a migration from BoltDB to Postgres. Let's kick it off. My question to you is, I've heard these databasers' names and there's kind of all of these things being thrown around, but I really want to understand how someone as astounded and as celebrated as yourself starts with an embedded key value store and somehow needs to migrate to a relational data store. Walk me through the then and now BoltDB to Postgres.
Well, when you are sort of first getting started on a software project, choosing an embedded key value store that's sort of native to the language you're using is a nice way to get started really quickly, prototype something. The problem with using a full relational database that you access through SQL initially is you have to kind of set up a lot of boilerplate. You have to start thinking about how am I going to do database migrations, and should I use an ORM? And if so, which ORM library should I use? And if not, how am I going to keep all my SQL in nice shape and not all messy and gross? So there's a lot of considerations initially if you just kind of want to get something down and see how it feels, to using a SQL database that makes it kind of hard to get going. But once you're a little ways into a project and your data model gets a little bit more complicated and you start wanting to do sort of more complex queries, it becomes clear pretty quickly that having a real relational database under the hood is going to save you more time than it costs you. So that was kind of the journey there.
I just got a request in from the live feed. Folks would appreciate it if you could be anything other than monotone in your responses and include maybe just a little bit of of up and down scale in how you're enunciating your words. Is that possible?
Should I sing my responses? Is that
Absolutely not. You're actually a decent singer, and I can't come back from any of that. So you kind of gave as typical engineer style half answers. We only got a little bit there before I was completely lost. So you said BoltDB was easy because it is native to the language were developing on. So what language is BoltDB native to?
go
Go where?
anywhere but here? Go Lang, the Go programming language.
Oh, okay. So BoltDB is built on Go, and therefore it's fully integrated. It's simple. I don't just have to import a package. How does it work?
Yeah, you just import a package and you call its API like you would with any Go library.
So it's
And
completely
it
native. Okay.
Yeah, versus if it's not an embedded database, you have to talk to it over the network. So you have to deal with all the messiness of, well, not necessarily. You could use like Unix domain sockets or something, but you kind of have to deal with the messiness of opening a connection and sending, encoding your data and decoding it. Whereas if it's native library calls, you don't have to deal with any of that.
That probably makes it pretty performant and pretty fast, quick.
It's quick for the things it's good at, but it's got very fast reads. Some types of inserts, depending on the workload, can be pretty slow. We're talking about BoltDB right now,
Mm.
and some like range scans can be pretty fast, but there's other types of queries that honestly that you kind of just have to implement yourself on top of the, because it's a pretty low level thing. It's just a key value store. It doesn't have the full richness of a query engine or SQL capabilities.
So should it be called even a database at that point?
Yeah, it's still a database. Actually, the question of what counts as a database is actually fairly interesting. You could make a pretty good argument that a file system is a database, or that Microsoft Excel is a database, or that your web browser is a database. Well, your web browser certainly has a database inside it.
Are you a
So
database?
you could argue it. You can tell me things, and I'll sometimes remember them, and you can ask me to recall them. So I think that would be a stretch. But the point is, like, what exactly is a database isn't super well defined, and any definition is going to be broad enough to encompass quite a lot of different things.
It would seem that it wouldn't be a very valuable data store if you have to write your own queries to be able to retrieve that data, even if it's just key value. Yeah.
I'm not sure what you mean.
What I thought I heard you say is there are not queries built in, and you actually have to build that to be able to query the data.
No, it has an API that allows you to do some queries. I mean, basic key value lookups, scans over, the key space, stuff like that. But you can't do like a filtered group by, with a join or, anything like that. It doesn't have the full richness of a the relational paradigm.
All right, so if you're a lazy engineer with no imagination, you're probably going to start with a native embedded language and a database across your language. Is that what I'm gathering so far?
Well, you certainly don't have to, but it's an option. It just depends on, what your use case is going to ultimately be, and uh, how much you benefit from being able to experiment quickly versus having something that you'll be able to stick with long term.
How long did you stick with BoltDB? Are we talking weeks, months, years?
It was quite a few months that we used BoltDB before we really felt the need to switch to something else.
Let's talk about that. What were the Was there a watershed moment, or was there a buildup? Was there just forever hatred all along the way?
You, the signals are you start to get into situations where you are having to denormalize your data. You're storing it in more than one way, or you're having to work around the lack of a proper query language by essentially writing, you know, filters in code and that kind of thing. And if you haven't used a real relational database before, it's harder to notice. But there's just a lot of things that you can do in SQL and with a relational database that make your life a lot easier. When you start having to join things together, or you have a lot of different data types that are interrelated, it becomes clear pretty quickly that there's a better way.
That's interesting because while I'm not the database expert, I haven't heard you bring up the concept of referential integrity when talking about going from a key value over to a full-on relational data store. I mean, you could use any NoSQL database to be able to do this work, and then plenty of high-level queries, but you went relational, and you haven't even mentioned the benefit of referential integrity. Did that not play a role? Was that not what you were looking for?
So when I say you have a more complex data model and you start to have to denormalize your data, that's kind of what I'm talking about, where if you're denormalizing your data, you're storing the same thing in more than one way, and that kind of makes it hard to guarantee integrity, especially if one data item is referencing another. You start to get into situations where you have to update things in multiple places, and it gets very, very messy. So yeah, I mean, referential integrity definitely a very, very useful property of relational databases.
So you're using BoltDB for months. It's easy, simple. However, the development has gone and gotten to a point it's matured that you need more out of your database. So you had to make a decision, I am assuming, to migrate to a new data store, which it sounds like is what happened. Did you consider having multiple data stores, keeping a key value store and then referential for, or I should say relational for what it's beneficial at? Why did you decide to do a full on lift and shift instead of something in parallel?
Multiple data stores is something best avoided unless you have absolutely no other choice. It's all the messiness of a data store that doesn't provide referential integrity is sort of multiplied when you have multiple data stores, because there's nothing built in that's going to help you guarantee that things are kind of copacetic across two different databases or data stores. So the reason most people would go there to multiple data stores would be for performance reasons, and in a very broad sense, you often have to split your analytical workloads from your transactional workloads. But yeah, that's go back and listen to episode 01.
The second one.
Yeah. But beyond that, you want to avoid it as much as possible, because and you want to keep those workloads as separate as possible. If you have one application that's talking to multiple data stores, you're often in for a rough time. And I mean, we've been there in the past where we had one application that was not one, not two, not three, but like four or more data stores that were all used for different things, and it's really not much fun to keep track of, or to operate, or to debug. It's very, very depressing.
Yeah, I don't know if I'm picking up what you're putting down. I talk to multiple data stores myself all the time. I talk to Amazon Video, I talk to Netflix, I talk to YouTube TV, all those data stores. I'm able to keep track of that. What's your deal?
Do you have interrelated data objects across
No,
those data stores?
I've got an Amazon Fire Stick. It's really easy. Just boom, boom, boom. Navigate, home button. Boop, boop. It's really easy. I don't understand why it's complicated for you to talk to multiple data stores.
Well, it's not complicated to talk to them, but if you're tracking related data objects that are stored across multiple data stores, or if you're storing the same data but in different ways across multiple data stores, that's usually where you run into trouble.
No, not having that problem. I just finished watching Smoking the Bandit on Netflix. and I'm lining up Cannonball Run 2 on Prime, I'm able to keep track of all of that, no problem.
Yeah, but you don't have like Smokey and the Bandit on Netflix and Smokey and the Bandit on Amazon Prime, or like some like you don't have half of it in one and half of it in the other.
I could
And
pay for it. I can get it on Prime if I want, but I'm going to the cheaper version, which is already free on Netflix. That's easy to keep track of.
yeah, but what if you started watching the free version on one, and then they discontinued it when you were in the middle of it? Maybe you had to take a break and they kicked it off. So then you switched to the paid version on the other one, but you couldn't remember where you were, so you were trying to fast forward and rewind, but their UI is terrible and your Fire Stick is super slow and you couldn't get it to the right spot, and your kids are screaming because they just want to watch it.
That's
Yeah.
almost exactly what happened. I Amazon Prime in the middle of watching the Matrix trilogy. I think I had just gotten done the second, and they stopped being free, and I had to go pay for the last one. I was really upset, but my kids
No,
weren't.
I think you're mistaken. There's only one Matrix movie. It's not a trilogy.
Okay, I must be mistaken there.
You want to talk about favorite movies? That's my favorite movie, The Matrix.
So, what pill are you taking?
Oh, I'm of the XKCD, crush them up together and snort them persuasion.
All right, back on track. So clearly, your limited brain power has issues managing multiple data stores, unlike mine. That's okay. So you have got to your watershed moment where BoltDB is not working in service to your solution. You're like, all right, we're going to go to a single data store. We're going to migrate, lift, and shift. Let's go find one. We've actually, let's talk about that for a second. How did you decide that you needed a relational RDBMS in general? Did you consider other NoSQL options, or was it straight up, yeah, we need relational?
No, NoSQL databases are stupid. You should use a relational database.
And why'd you start with BoltDB?
Well, because it's an embedded key value store. It's barely even a database.
All right. So then you're like, okay, we want a relational data store.
Hey, no, let me
And
let me let me answer that again. So, if you're going to go to the trouble of standing up a database that runs as a separate service, and you got to connect to it and talk to it with a query language, use a relational database. Unless you have an incredibly good reason not to. Like, there are definitely some use cases and where you won't get the performance you need, but almost 99% of the time you can find a relational database that will support your needs, and you will be better off in the long run, because millions of people know SQL does everything, and relational databases, especially ones like Postgres, have been around for a long time. They're very mature. They have an incredible depth of capability that most people aren't even aware of. 1% of the capabilities that are under there. If you learn to use them and learn to use them well, they're going to serve almost everything until you get up into like truly big data use cases where you're the LHC at CERN, or your Facebook, or your Google, or your Netflix, and you have just a truly absurd amount of data. If you're not in one of those situations, you're probably going to be just fine on Postgres. You can scale up to a massive compute instance running behind that, and you'll be just fine, and you won't have to deal with a lot of the distributed systems complexity and the NoSQL nonsense and all this stuff.
yeah, so all right, so let's talk about that. So you've chosen a relational data store. Did you consider like DB2, maybe IBM Lotus? What about like MSQL, or maybe Yugabyte DB times 10? What are the data relational data stores did you consider?
What notes are you reading right now? What Lotus?
Reading out of my database. I have lots of databases. I find no issue getting the information out of them. Did you consider Rethink DB, or maybe SAP HANA, Percona Extra DB cluster,
SAP
Paradox,
HANA, if you want to go broke. No,
Firebird,
we
Firebird, because that's Smokey and the Bandit database.
no, that those all seem bad. We considered the relational databases which are available on AWS in RDS, so managed by AWS, which is basically Postgres and MySQL, and I think there might be another one, but it was some weird one like MS SQL or something. Not, I mean, MS SQL I'm sure is fine, but Postgres and MySQL, everyone that I've worked with for a while has used them in the past. They're comfortable with them, so it was kind of between those.
Yeah, all right. So you didn't go with MySQL. Why not MySQL? MySQL is usually a fan favorite.
Yeah, MySQL's fine. We might have to switch to it at some point because I think AWS actually supports it slightly better for certain things like blue green deployments and stuff. But honestly, like switching from Postgres to MySQL is not a huge lift. We probably have a few queries that would need to be tweaked slightly to do that, but for the most part, they're going to be interchangeable for a lot of what we're doing because we're not. I mean, we're not using any like super wacky features of Postgres. So uh, it was almost arbitrary, which one to choose.
Arbitrary. Nothing better in software than arbitrary choices. I love that when I get asked by the executive leadership team, they go, "Oh, why'd you do that?" And like, arbitrary. That is just instills confidence in the world that I know what I'm doing. Appreciate that.
I mean, I don't see why it wouldn't. Like some choices are arbitrary. Like they don't matter, and you shouldn't spend a lot of time on them.
Did you inquire to your Chatter GPT which database it would recommend?
No, I did not.
All right.
I did on that slight tangent here, but this will be something that people might actually want to hear about. I did have a really interesting conversation with GPT-4 today where I was asking it
Can you give it a
about.
name? Can you give it a name like a pseudonym or something? Give it a name. Hal or Kit or something other than I was talking to Chat GPT-4.
No, that would be very confusing.
Ursula. How about just something? Little Mermaid from the 1980s. Just saying.
No, that's a good one too. That's probably second on my list behind Die Hard. No, I'm not. No, but I asked it. I was asking it about flock and fcontrol, which are system calls for doing file locking on Unix systems, and I asked it how I could read the state of a lock without acquiring it, and it gave me some code to do that, and I tested out the code, and it didn't work. And I was like, "Hey, will that work on Mac OS?" And it was like, "Oh yeah, sure, it'll definitely work on Mac OS." And I was like, "Okay." Well, I did this, and it didn't work, and it was like, sorry about that. I've done some more research, and it looks like that won't work.
Are you kidding me?
No, so it corrected itself, and it the way that it did was very funny to me. The fact that it said it did some more research and then it discovered, oh yeah, that won't actually work. So yeah, it's funny how by prompting these models, you can work your way into different dark corners of them that sort of have different bits of knowledge. But yeah, always verify what you get out of an LLM before you check it in to your repository.
Yeah, I'm failing to understand. I'm failing to understand why you needed your Ursula to even do a man page on Flock, right? Like sysinternals is pretty basic for Linux, but maybe that's just maybe.
Oh, is it? File locking is pretty basic and straightforward on Linux. That's a solved problem.
Well, for some of us. I mean, there are
Let me
there are
let me send
others.
you let me send you a blog post from
Oh, well, if it's
renowned.
written on the internet, then I better believe it, right?
Hey, listen, from renowned distributed systems expert Kyle Kingsbury.
Who?
Have you heard of the Jepson series?
Which bot is that?
It's not a bot.
I only believe
It's an
content that's generated from
actual
bots.
actual bag of meat human
Bag of
being.
meat. Okay. Getting back on track. So we are now talking about migrating to Postgres. So you're migrating an embedded native OS, which is probably fully intertwined in your code, because I'm sure you're not abstracting it out like a really suave engineer. So I'm sure it's all spaghettied inside your code. How do you lift and shift to I don't want to call it a managed service. It's not a managed service, but it's a full on separate service in a database. Was it hard to do, easy to do? What did you learn on that?
It was not easy, but it wasn't too bad. So we did have all the storage access behind an interface. So in theory, it was re-implement this interface against Postgres, and you'll be good to go. In practice, the interface had some assumptions baked into it that were kind of specific to the way an embedded key value store like BoltDB works, and so some bits of it had to be reworked. But in general, it was just a process of going through that interface and the BoltDB implementation and figuring out how to implement that in Postgres. So I mean, the first thing we did was kind of like write down what we thought the Postgres data model would look like, and then we kind of worked off that as we did the port.
So what was the biggest lesson that you learned along all of that?
The biggest lesson that we learned, next time I would just start with a SQL database. I would just bite the bullet and pay the cost of standing up migrations and all
That
that
goes to my
stuff.
last question. So I'll ask it and then you can just continue talking. So I'm a startup and I'm trying to decide between, a native embedded data store like BoltDB or just starting off with a relational data store, Postgres. How would you advise me? And it sounds like your advice is learn from your mistakes because you're making them all the time. And that's why we're doing this podcast for people just to, not make all of those mistakes you're making. Is that the feedback to folks? Just bite the bullet up front and go to a relational data store?
It, if you're doing a quick prototype of something to test out if an idea is going to work, and you're ready to throw it away when you're done to build the production version, an embedded key value store is probably fine. But I don't think it's going to hurt you too much to kind of get facile with setting up all the boilerplate you need to use a SQL database, because you're going to want one in almost any non-trivial situation. So I wouldn't shy away from it. That would be my advice.
All right, folks, you heard it here from Mr. Jaffee. Learn from his mistakes. Be better, and don't listen to Chatter Ursula about how to manage file locks. And just so you know, Flock is not going to tell you if there's a deadlock or not. I mean, maybe I should have just written this code. Maybe it would have taken less time. Maybe you should have asked me instead of your little bot there how to do the file locking.
Yeah, so I did want to circle back on that, because file locking in Linux systems and Unix systems in general is such a mess. It's unbelievable, especially if you have like shared file systems in the background, or you're going through libraries, or you have older operating system versions. It is it's such an absolute crapshoot. It's amazing. But I'll find that article that I was talking about, and I'll post it in the YouTube description and the notes for the podcast, in case anybody's interested, or if anybody's messing around with file locking thinking it's going to be a fun, easy time. It won't be.
All right. Jaffee, those are all of my questions about your both DB and Postgres migration surprise episode. Anything else you'd like to add? Other challenges? It sounds like you had a really hard time, and you've grown a lot as an engineer. Glad I was able to shepherd this along. Any final thoughts for our listeners?
Final thoughts. Let's see. Check us out on Twitter at Smart Snarkcast. Every podcast directory, Smart and Snark, smartandsnark@gmail.com. If you have any questions or feedback for us, we would love to hear it from one of our 16 subscribers or from someone who hasn't subscribed yet. But yeah, I think that's all we've got today.
So, best movie of the 80s? Are we thinking Die Hard? Are we thinking Ghostbusters? What do we got?
The Little Mermaid.
Thank you, everybody. Ciao.